here filming a series of interviews with some of the greatest jazz musicians in our country, and we're building an archive of these video interviews for Hamilton College. We are here with Buddy Tate, one of the greatest tenor sax players who's ever lived, and a person who can tell us a great deal about experiences with the Count Basie Band. Greetings.
Thank you.
I'd just like to open with a few questions. I'd like to ask you, how did you first get attracted to the field of jazz? And how young were you when you started playing?
Well, I must have been about 14, between 14 and 16 years of age. And we had a family band in my hometown in Sherman, Texas. And it was a nice little old band. It was a good band. And we'd played towns like, well, I'd say from Sherman to, we'd go to Oklahoma City and Ardmore, Oklahoma, and places like that. And now my first professional band that I worked with was a band by the name of T. Holder's 12 Clouds of Joy, who later became Andy Kirk's 12 Clouds of Joy. And I left home with them when I was about, well, between us, I'd say 14 and 16, and went to the coldest place in the world, I thought, was Duluth, Minnesota, which it was 50 below zero.
Wow.
And I thought the world was coming to an end. And from there, where'd I go? From Andy Kirk, from T. Holder, I worked with Victoria Spivey's 10-Ton Review, and that's when I first met Lester Young, and he was with King Oliver. Came down in Tulsa, Oklahoma, came down. We had some sessions together, and from there I went back to T. Holder again, and off and on I worked with bands like Lucky Melander and Benny Goodman, and then I formed my own group, and Celebrity Club that was in Harlem, and I worked there for 21 years with my group. And from then on, I've been doing solos and, things like this by myself, and traveling more until I had several health problems, and that cut off the traveling. So that's where I am today. That's about it.
And tell us now, when you started playing, what other things were there for youngsters to do? Because today there's a myriad of things, but why did music seem to be attractive to you at that time? What other things could you have gone into?
Well, I really wanted to farm. We had a farm, and I lived on a farm, but my brother, I had two older brothers, and one played piano, one played saxophone. And but I wanted to be a trombone player, and I used to get the curtains off the wall and slide up and down on the wall. So then I wanted to be a trombone player, actually, and my brother bought me a saxophone because I used to try to put his reeds and things on, and I'd break them all up. So he says, well, I bought you this saxophone. I'm going to try to get you a teacher. Well, there weren't many teachers in that town. And if you play anything, it's going to be this. So that's actually what got me started playing the saxophone. a white friend of mine was playing, had a beautiful sound, and he used to play at the theaters, and that was before talkies. And he played at the theater, and every day about 2:30 he'd go play at the theater. And I used to stand out and listen to this. Well, I couldn't go to that theater with prejudice, you know, and racial things in those days. But I'd go out in the back and listen to him play. And he would tell me, he says, I told him how pretty his sound was. He says, yeah, but I can't play no jazz. I said, oh, you can play jazz. I says, he says, I heard you play some jazz. And he says, if you teach me how to play jazz, I'll teach you how to read and play pretty. So we developed a very nice friendship. And of course, he got out of the music business. And
But I want to ask you a question here. So then the music became a catalyst that was more important than the racial barrier, because he had something you wanted to learn, and you had something he wanted to learn.
That's right. That's true. And, well, we got along fine because then I was playing alto, and he taught me how to transpose, taught me a lot of things. And there was another boy, black boy, that played trumpet and saxophone. But he loved carnivals and minstrels. There was a lot of minstrel shows. And every time if we didn't lock him up when a minstrel show come to town, he'd be gone, you know. And his name was Emmett Malone. He's very good arranger and everything. I don't know where he got the music knowledge from. He's just sort of like a musical family, too.
Uh-huh.
And he could write, arrange. So from then on, it's been like, you know.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned this other player. You mentioned his tone, and you said you liked his tone. Would you consider that you also have a signature tone where people can just hear your tone and know that's you?
I've tried for that to happen, and that's what I hope is coming across, because we, in those days, we tried to be individual, you know, to say, oh, that's Young, that's Buddy Tate, that's Herschel Evans. So that's what we tried to do then. And, you know, we didn't want to, like if you got the same teacher, if everybody's sounding the same, you don't know who's who. So we didn't want it that way, you know. So I've tried to do it the way so they could say I could be identified.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Now, talk to us about when you first started with Basie.
Well, I was with Basie's first band in 1934, 33, which was short-lived. And actually, he was working with Benny Moten at that time. And, but Moten was having a lot of problems with his getting work. So Basie got a job in, I think it was Little Rock, Arkansas. And he came to Little Rock, and I was there. And I worked with him there in that band.
How did you meet? How did you audition for him or get that spot?
Well, let's see, I'm trying to think, had I been with Andy Kirk? No, I don't think so. But he needed a tenor, and he wasn't too well known, you know. And he was glad for me to be with his band, you know. Then I worked with that band. But later then he went back to Benny Moten, Hot Lips Page, and all of those guys. They went back with Benny Moten. So then when Benny Moten died, or your Walter Page. I don't want to leave him out. When Benny died, Basie was the one that took over the band. And then he sent and got me to join him again. So that's when I went back and worked with him for about, I guess about 12, 13 years off on.
Uh-huh. And what year was this when you first started with the Basie band?
And the first Basie band was in '33, the short-lived one. Then the next one was in '39. I joined him in 1939, and that was after he was famous.
Uh-huh.
He was famous then in 1939 when I joined him. Then I went and I stayed about 10, 12 years.
A question I wanted to ask you is, you know, Basie has been quoted as saying that his band was developed from the rhythm section and then up through the tenor sax positions and then to the rest of the band.
Yeah, he loved tenors. You see, in those days, you only had one tenor player, featured tenor player. But he always had two, so he started out with Herschel and Lester. So he had two of the world's greatest, and wasn't nobody, he had to make it. So when he went to when he went to New York, they just chopped everybody down, you know. And that rhythm section, he had Walt Page, Joe Jones. That was all the American rhythm section, and himself, you know, Freddie Green, and that was quite a band.
I wanted to ask you about that particular sound. There were different sounds. They say a different feel to the music that there was in the Southwest than on the West Coast or on the New York scene. Could you describe for us how you felt the sound of the Basie band was different?
Well, see, like in New York bands, they could only play like in a fast tempo, something like this.
Uh-huh.
And of course, Basie came in, and they could play like they call it when they call it the Midwest swing, and swing like that.
Uh-huh.
But these other bands was up in here, and they would kill the chicks, you know, the chorus girls and things they were playing. So when they brought the Basie band in and they started playing in here, and they could throw their legs up there and dance to that tempo and swing, they said, "This is it. Where did they come from?"
Uh-huh.
So that's the way that was. They called it the Midwest. That's where that call, you know, came from.
So that you say that feel is more relaxed?
It was more relaxed, but still swinging.
Uh-huh.
And was more swinging. And they was just having fits and jumping and having fits, and they would be swinging, and those guys would be taking those fine solos and things behind them. And it was just swept the whole thing away. And it was Chick Webb, but Chick played everything, had to be up here.
Uh-huh.
You know, had to be up there. And they didn't have the Midwest swing. And then in come Jay McShann, after Basie. Then they all had a different thing, Andy Kirk had a more of a sweet band. People like Faye Turl and Mary Lou. They could swing, but they were softer than Basie and people like that, you know. There were good bands in Kansas City then. Musicians come out from New York, what was supposed to be the big name, and they'd get a lesson. When they come to Kansas City, they'd come to New York to get a lesson, Kansas City to get a lesson.
Tell us about some of your better recordings with the Basie band.
I like this. Well, I tell you, I like this song. A recording date was called "Ham and Eggs" from the record. You mean? They were, you know, like '78, so they weren't albums. And
now, were those records like you could only put 3 minutes on a side?
yeah, Mm-hmm. I think they later put them in some albums and things. They got together and put them on. And what's the thing called Super Chief? Ham and eggs and see what else? Tickle Toe. That was with Lester. You remember that?
I've been in bands that played arrangements of that.
Yeah. I took the middle. That's it. That was mine. Yeah, that was Lester's Tickle Toe. It was written from a pimp.
Tell us about that. Tell us about that.
Well, his name was Tickle Toe. This pimp in Tulsa. And I don't know, he loved to hang around the musicians and everything. So we liked him very much. And so Prez wrote a song and named it Tickle Toe. Of course, Lester declined in his later years from health problems, though, with Lester. I never know what put him on the wrong track, because for so many years he was just a health bug. And he was very unhappy with himself. The last time we were together, we played up the Newport Jazz Festival, and he was very sick. He was drinking and drinking. And I rode back with him from Newport, and we got lost, this Newport is ordinarily 2 hours ride, but we got lost, and it was all night. But I'm happy we did, because not knowing that it was going to be my last time with him, you know. And he said to me that night, he says, you know, I never really made it big. I said, what are you talking about? I ignored him at first, and he said, did you hear what I said? He says, I never really made it. I said, what are you talking about? I says, there's only two. He says, they either play like you or play like Coleman Hogan. So I says, you got more imitators than anybody in the world. He said, but, and he says, all the others are making the money, you know. He said, I have no evil eyes. He says, but I never really made any money. He didn't make any money that night.
When you started with the Basie Band, what kind of money was a musician making at that time?
Not much. The first band, we weren't making anything hardly. And then in the latter band in 1939, we...
what were you coming home with a week in your pocket?
Let's see, in the last band, you mean in the 39 band? Well, it was better then, but not as what it should have been. We made several films, and we would kind of get over, because we made Hit Parade of 43 and Dorothy Dandridge and Hell's Poppin', but Olson and Johnson, I believe it was. And then we made some money with Ethel Waters, and is Lena Horne in that? I think she was in Stormy. No, it was Captain Stormweather. We didn't. But when we made those films and things, we made.
So you get royalties from that?
We would. No, we didn't get any royalties. We got paid a flat salary, and that was it. You know what I mean? Yeah. And,
which is
which
yet another
should
issue.
have been, yeah.
Which is yet another issue.
That's right. Should have been, but no. I don't even think Basie was getting any royalties, but it should have been. And you got paid, and that was it.
Now you talked about Lester saying he never felt that he really made it big, because I don't think he would have said that because any lack in the power of his playing, because he knew he had imitators. He knew that a lot of people were trying to play like him. But, once again, here we are at an issue where the musician is not receiving the diagnostic thing back that he needs. Other musicians will come up to him and say, "Oh man, I love the way you play,"
Mm-hmm.
But he wasn't getting the feedback that he needed in other arenas.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you feel that you have gotten some of the respect that you deserve? And if you could have gotten more, what would it have been?
Well, I don't know. I don't have too many. I don't have too many gripes, really. I'm kind of satisfied with the way I've done. Because see, when I organized my band, I was the leader.
Uh-huh.
And I paid the salary. And for 21 years, I was on a job,
Right.
one job. So I kind of made it up there,
Uh-huh.
And but Prez used to say, he would refer to people as, he wasn't no faggot or anything, but he acted like it, He says, I don't know, he says, all the ladies, they say try to play like me, he says, but they're making all the money. He says, I'm not making any money. So he says, sometimes, I don't know if they're playing like me or I'm playing like them. He said little funny things like that, So he really didn't make too much money because he was, everybody was trying to stay out of the army, and a lot of musicians beat it because there was a lot of jobs and things then, with everybody going in there, and the musicians just wasn't no army material, And so I remember one time we were out in California, and this little guy came out there that night and had his chain, zoots, to collect his suit and chain, like Cab used to wear and all that kind of stuff. So he said, and he parted with us all night, me and Sweets, Harry Edison and Lester. And after we'd take our break, we'd come over and we'd go over and he'd buy us everybody drinks and everything. And Prez was drinking pretty heavy then. And so at the end of the night, he pulled it back like this, showed he was a policeman. He says, I want you to be at Induction Center tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I know where you live. And Prez had a heart attack almost, man. Oh, my God. He says, how could he be like that? I had confidence in the little guy. I started to give him a stick of pot. I said, if you had it, you wouldn't have been going to the army. Yeah, he just, because he didn't do no smoke pot, he hadn't started drinking too much. He says, it broke his heart,
Mm-hmm.
So they carried him down to, send him to Fort Bragg, then they sent him to Alabama. And it was rough down there, man. And he was down there trying to grow him some little marijuana patch, and had him a little patch. And they put him in a brig, and he told me he could only see through the hole, just about like that, And Norman Grant, the impresario, went down and got him out, and he's the one that got him out. So, and he was down in Alabama, so Norman says, was telling him who he was and everything. And he's Jewish, They said, well, we don't care no more about you than we do about him.
Mm.
That's what they told him.
Mm.
He says, yeah, but if you person me, he says, you'll hear about it. So he got him out. But he went down after that.
I want to ask you a question about jazz. You know, we had talked about, you had talked about this too, how that in the early years of jazz, of course, before a certain time, like before Benny Goodman, all the bands were pretty much segregated.
Mm-hmm.
And then he began to hire Lionel Hampton and Teddy Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
But it seemed to me that the music was the one thing that allowed people to go back and forth without all these barriers. You know, do you see a way that we can use music today to do the same things? Because it seems to me that on the past, 3 or 4 years, particularly, that the barriers are going up again almost. And I'd like to see music
Be integrated more.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it should be. Well, they have it in the smaller groups. We don't have the big bands really to mix it more.
Uh-huh.
With more because we don't have big bands. But that's one thing that they never paid much attention to,
Uh-huh.
That's because Benny would do what he wanted to do, and so did Jimmy Dorsey. He had a black girl named June Richmond, and boy, she could sing, boy, and he brought her all from California all through Texas and everywhere with him, and so you got to give him credit for that. And this is Jimmy, not Tommy. Jimmy Dorsey, his brother, Then, of course, Tommy had Charlie Shavers writing for in his band, and Saul Oliver writing all his arrangements, and so it was more integration, more. Of course, we had more musicians, and as I say, had bigger bands and things like that. So, I don't know. See, who's got a small group and got it integrated? Let's see. Nancy?
Uh-huh.
I think she's got an integrated small group. And did Carmen Ray? Carmen had an integrated small group. So, it's just, the integration is according like with the time now, because you don't have big bands, you don't have big, you don't have big bands, and you don't have many integrated musicians because of that.
A couple of last questions I would like to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
Was the Basie Band the best big band there ever was?
Swinging. I thought so. I thought it was. Because it could play, basically sit and play in here, right in this room, and swing like a dog. And the room didn't have to be no bigger than this. And he could keep the band down and be swinging like crazy. And I thought he had about the best swinging band.
One last question I would like to ask you is, if you could give a word to the field of music, if you wanted to leave a word behind you, a word of wisdom, to younger musicians who would come after you and learn something from you, what would you tell them about tone, about phrasing, about music, about spirit?
Well, I would tell them to practice and listen. Don't think you know it all. Always listen, because everybody got something to say. And keep swinging. I tell them keep trying to blow. And always listen, because everybody's got something to say. Never think you know it all.
So you gotta stay hungry.
You gotta stay hungry. Yeah, never know it all.
Do you have a funny little story about the Basie Band that you could leave us with?
Well,
Or anything that happened? Al asked me to talk to you about one night that you and another player got lost or got left behind or something on a trip.
with Basie?
Yeah.
No, I got lost. We got left behind with the Nat Tolles' band a lot of times, because Tolles would leave. Sometimes it wouldn't be nobody but him. If we were supposed to leave at a certain time, he would leave. And he left us and left me and Henry Coker, who later became a great trombone player, man. And he left us in Moore Hour somewhere. and we went out and got pickpockets. Somebody pickpocketed us, and we got our money back, but in more. I lied. And I tried to pull Coker's coat, you know, because I had seen this happen. You know, whatever you say, you get pickpocketed, you had to make it good, you know. So when I knew this and I'd seen this happen, you know. So I think we got pickpocketed for about $15 a piece. Wasn't no money, man, you know. So I wake up, everybody's gone, money's gone. So when I went to the landlord of the house and told him that we didn't have any money and what happened. So he cursed us out and everything. So I says, okay. So I went on down to the police station. And the policeman, captain there, was a trumpet player. He says, I know where you were. I see. He called the name of the house. He said, come on. And he put us in the car and carried us back in there. Man, they were sitting around in there gambling and having a good time. He went in and he says, now I'll let y'all operate, gamble, do everything you want. But when you start that stealing, I'll close your house down right now. So when he says, what did you say you lost? I said, $30. I said, he did too. He said, no, I didn't lose the 15. I said, you had the same thing I did. I kept trying to prove, no, I didn't have 15. He was honest, but I lied.
Yeah, allow for a little inflation, huh?
Yeah. So they give us that money. So then the policeman says, now what do you all want to do? You want to stay here or you want us to take you to the train station? I said, I want you to take us to the bus station and stay with us till that bus gets ready to leave to go back to Omaha.
Right.
Because I know them cats, man. I didn't know these cats would send somebody after us, you know. So they killed us and put us on the bus, and we went on to Omaha. Then I wouldn't speak to Tolles no more. I didn't speak to him for about a week. I wouldn't play with him or anything like that because he went off and left us, you know.
We would like to ask you, Georgette, if the two of you can kind of recall some experiences for us that perhaps I might miss.
I have many, many happy stories with my father.
Share one of them.
With when you're raised with musicians, actors, singers, they are I think that song best describes that there's no people like show people, and it's true. He doesn't like to hear this. I think they're all rather shy about that. But as the children, and it's how we see it, they are different. They are special, and they're great. If I had all the money in the world, I wouldn't trade it for him as a father. He's been my best friend, my advisor. He's a very sensitive person, and he's a very wise man. I think as teenagers, you know how we can be, and when we're young, we feel like we know it all, like you said. But as I got older, I really began to see how wise he was. And if ever I have questions. But there's so many funny stories. I remember as a little, when we were in California, I was about 3 years old, and he tells me this, I vaguely remember it, when he was making a movie. And I've always been a night owl because he'd get home at 2 or 3, and I'd always wait with him, and we'd have breakfast early in the morning, and I thought that was hot stuff. And he'd come home, and I heard something about movies, and I knew this, and I started to, he got up, and I jumped up, and I got my bag, and I had my hat, and I was trying to get ready and putting the shoes on the wrong feet, and Daddy always tells this story much funnier than I do, and my mother said something to the effect, why did you tell her this? She's not going. And I knew California, Hollywood. I knew that at 3. And he said, you tell her, because he said,
She says,
I'm getting ready for this affair.
Mother, I see you not going. I'm going with Daddy. And she was about 3 years old. So when he says, I see you not going.
You're not gonna make
He
it.
says, but I'm going. And so I couldn't take it, that time morning, because we were making this picture. I don't know what she was, Elder popping over with Dorothy Damage. Anyway, but she wanted to go. She wanted to go everywhere where I'd go. And I remember when the night she was born, I wanted to see her, and the visiting hours was just about the time we were working at the Panther Room in Chicago, and we'd have to go to work early in the afternoon. And so one night I says, he says, well, just go by there and talk to the lady. So we went by there, and here she was, awake, 3 o'clock in the morning. So when the lady says, I could lose my job for this. I said, but I don't see no little girl. I said, I haven't seen her. So she says, okay, come on, because Basie is my favorite band.
All right.
So she let me see her. And there she was, winking eye. Just a wink eye like this. I don't know where she got that from. She was winking eye when I had a baby in the arms. She'd be winking eye.
Uh-huh.
And people on the subway, I'd have on the subway in New York, and she'd be winking eye. And we'd break up the subway. People just couldn't understand. Let me hold her, let me hold her.
There's a story I remember traveling with Basie, and at that time they traveled on the trains, and this is when they had the berths that you could sleep in, and then you'd have every morning with the wives and with the kids of all the musicians would come, and we'd come to breakfast. And there was Snooky, played the trumpet with Basie at the time, and then there's Earl Warren. I'd have names for all of them. Well, musicians have names for each other, Smiley and Sweets and
Cat Eye was Buck.
Buck Clayton and
Dickie Wells
Dickie
was...
Wells. They all had names for each other. And then I knew they had names, so I started naming them. And I used to call Earl Warren Egghead. And because and Sweets, he always would take me to get strawberry ice cream, but I always bothered him. He said, you always bug me. There's your father, go ask your father. I said, no, I want you to get me the strawberry ice cream, because he always money.
He would be asleep, and I would be asleep, and she wouldn't. She would be on the train, and she'd wake him up. And so he says, tell your father to go get this for you, Georgia. You sleep. He said, I was.
And I always tease him right today. I asked him, I need some money.
Yes,
He's like,
we
go
used to
ask
tell
your
you
father. But I remember...
They all had a spoil, all the guys in the band.
I remember Sweet's daughter. Not Sweet. It was Snooky. He had 3 kids. There was Pepper, Judy, and it was another. We had difference in age, and a lot of us the parents would pack their lunches, and I remember we would wait when it was like when they'd all settled down, and we would go in and pull these boxes down, and Pepper, Snooky's son, would pull down the cake, and the cake was all over him, and and then we would get in trouble with, you know, we were always, there was so many of us. I can remember different members of the band, their kids, when we traveled. I remember once I pulled away from my mother and my father, and I was with Freddie Green, and the trains would come in and they would stop, you know, abruptly and yank back and forth. And between where you step from the curb to the train, there was an opening. It wasn't closed off. And I slipped under somehow. And I remember he just came, I don't know where he was. I was there with him. He just came and pulled me up. And I remember being very upset about it. And
I was scared to death. Me
and
too.
I threw up. But, you know, and I remember. But I remember more than falling under the train was I had on this
Freddie
slip.
turned all loose. And after, you know, take now, somebody would always take her. So, but he would turn loose and the train be, you know how they're hooking and shaking, and she fell down under, almost fell out of the water.
I was so
Could've been a
embarrassed because I
disaster.
had my slip on. And I said, why is everybody asking me these questions? And they see I have on my slip. That's all I could think about. And my mother was, you know, are you all right? I'm fine. And mother, and they were worried out too a little bit. But I was concerned. Everybody saw me in my slip. I mean, these are the kind of stories that Judy and I it was always an experience. All of us was always, I remember Basie would play, and they had a show, and there was chorus girls, and they had great big satin balls. And the girls would be on top of the ball, and they would come across.
Theater.
And I remember Pepper and I, we saw our parents playing on stage, and we didn't know the show had started. And we ran out on stage, and then we looked out, and there was all these
in
people.
the big Roxy Theater.
And they were looking at them, and everybody started to laugh, and then we laugh, and then they clap, and then we clap. And Basie said, would you please get them? And it was so many.
In the big Roxy Theater.
I remember that. I can remember all the lights and all the beautiful people. And I remember so many. I remember Lena watching her make up her face, and I used to say, when I get big, I want to be like her. And I remember, can't think of her name. You just said Carmen.
Margaret?
You know, there's, as a child, I think, Dinah Washington,
Yes.
Sarah Vaughan. I met them all. And I loved Billie Holiday. I loved Billie. She was, I just loved Billie. She was special. She was very special.
Yeah, she had, her choice of songs were different. She would sing like Good Morning Heartaches. And she'd pick the right songs, and just for her. I guess it's because she lived a, you know, a sad life. And Good Morning Heartaches, Fine and Mellow. And what was the next one she sang? She used to do that. I can't remember, but I dug her choice. Nat King Cole was another one. Picked the right songs to sing.
Do you have any other little anecdotes you'd like to give us?
Well, it is, I would listen to, speaking of big bands, there was Fonso Trent and Coon Saunders. They used to come from Kansas City, this white band, original Nighthawks. Had a hell of a band. And who else? Coon Saunders, Fonso Trent.
Was Trent out of Oklahoma City?
No, Alfonso Trent was actually, they were really ahead of their time. They were from, he's from Arkansas, but he was rich. He was from his family, they had plenty of money. And they had all kind of uniforms. They were sharp-looking cats, and they'd go in those white hotels and stay a year. They went in the Dolphus Hotel, but no more black bands in them hotels. Then they'd go to San Antonio, to the Gunner, and they played all those hotels and things like that. So, personally, I always want to be with Shrimp because of this. You know, they had such good reputation and they never got stranded like bands were getting stranded in those days. You know, and big cars and all like that. Of course, they had to take the freight elevator when they come to work. They looked like the guests in the Davos Hotel. But when they got on that stand, the first drummer I ever seen was the solo drummer, was a drummer by the name of A.G. Godley. Buddy Rich loved him. Joe Jones loved him. All the drummers knew about A.G. Godley. And the band would get off the bandstand, and he'd play for about 10 or 15 minutes by himself, changing rhythms all the time. And
here's a large picture of Alfonso Trent's band. And I remember looking at these musicians, and he's not one to brag, but he always said he had the sharpest band in the world. Because they dressed, they had uniforms, and they were all good-looking, very handsome men. And when we lived in Manhattan before we moved to Long Island, one of my girlfriend's name was Joni Crook, and there was her father played for for Alfonso. And I can remember thinking to myself when I was 10, I must have been around 10. He was very tall, very handsome. I said, Daddy said all those men that was in that band was handsome. And I remember it applied with Joan's father, that they were all, certain stories he'll tell when he feels like talking. I don't forget certain
taking
things.
people's wives and things.
Oh, right there.
That band was so...
I've got a picture here. Maybe you can see what you remember about that. 1940.
Yeah, I sure do. Yes, sir. That was made, I'm trying to remember where. Let's see. Pages in here.
Walter Page.
Yeah.
Who else is Dickie Wells in
You remember that night?
there?
I'm trying to see. What is? No, I was thinking this would be made at Treasure Island in Los Angeles, but remember when they had the Treasure Island in 1939? You people are too young.
San Francisco.
San Francisco?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. No, it wasn't there. I don't know where this was.
Does it say the year? Maybe you can.
I think it says
1940.
Savoy Ballroom.
That's New York.
Might be in Savoy Ballroom. Yeah, I'll kill you. 1940. 39, something like 39. Yeah, it was, might have been in Savoy Ballroom.
I think
I
about
thought
Chick
it was,
Webb and
I thought it would be
Savoy.
after 39, but it says 1940. Yes, Harry Edison's here.
Sweet.
Ed Lewis, Buck Clayton, Vic Dickerson, Dickie Wells, Dan Minor. There's some heavy cats in here. Freddie, Tab Smith. Tab always loved, music-wise, he loved Basie's band, but Lucky didn't care nothing about no money. He would, what Basie would pay him $250 a week, Lucky would give him $500. That's the way he was if he wanted a musician. And his mother worked for Al Capone. And so he never worried about no money. And when Ralph Capone and all of them people, they were very, crazy about Lucky. So Lucky said one time they were playing, well, he was running around Chicago just, by himself singing from club to club like this. So Al Capone, his mother worked for Al Capone, and he always talked with a cigar in his mouth, in the corner of his mouth. Never took it out when he talked, you know. So he says, Claire, what the Lucky want? She said, oh, well, he doesn't want anything. He says, he's all right, Mr. Capone. He said, I mean something big. I want him to have something big. I like Lucky. So Lucky says, tell him come to dinner tonight. So Lucky said, he went to dinner. He said, Lucky, I want you to have something big. I want something. So he says, well, I'd like to have a band someday, Mr. Capone. Someday I'd like to have my own band. So he says, you want a band? And he says, yeah. He says, that night in one of his clubs, he had a band by the name of Walter Barnes. They were all burned to death down in Florida a few years later, you know. And he said he went to work. When he went there that night, he said he walked right up to the bandstand and pulled Walter Barnes by the tail of his tuxedo and told him to come down and took Lucky like this and put him up there in front of the band. He said, Lucky said, I saw that story. He gave him about $2,500 and says, I want Lucky to have this band. You go get another band. Oh. I'll give him a job. I want Lucky said, I saw the record. Said, took that man's band in 20 minutes.
True story. Pretty good time.
Yeah, he wanted Lucky to have that band. I remember when Lucky, of course this was after, when Lucky passed, he had flowers from here to that corner, from Ralph Capone, Al's brother. And he dropped on the streets of a heart attack, and had $1,000 in his pocket. And when they carried him to the hospital, he was so well liked. He had his $1,000. Nobody got it. On 125th Street in New York.
Good Lord, he was like.
Yeah, I'm telling you. And he just went there, all in flowers, as big as that lad, Ralph Capone. Yeah, he was in with them. Yes. So and this is the boy he liked, was Tab Smith.
Uh-huh.
That's the one, and he was playing with Lucky.
What size was the band at that time? What was
This
the full
band?
instrumentation at?
Well, we got about 1, 2, 3, got 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3.
Joe Jones on there.
Yeah. See, prayers, Jack. Yeah, it's 5 seconds there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 saxophone, and maybe 4 or 5 trombone.
Trumpets.
There's Sweets and Buck, Vic Dixon, Dan Minor.
It seems to me that like the players at that time were not only good players, but real personalities.
Yeah, you had to. You had to be nice too. Because if you didn't, you didn't get the gig. You had to do more than just play. You had to be a nice person, because we had a lot of friends, and that's what they wanted you to have. They used to say, well, Basie was just Basie was alley cat, just down there cat. When it was much different between he and Duke. Duke was a beautiful cat, but he associated with the bigger people, like doctors and things like that. You might catch Basie in the alley with crap shooter. But and Lunsford was more like Duke, Only he had Lunsford had his nose in the air though. He was He's a school teacher, and he wanted the band to be just students. I mean, school kids. You know, like it was a lot of different personalities and things.
Tell us one of the, if you can share with us, who do you think was, if you were assigning, let's say, personality to the band, who would have been the class clown of the band?
Clown?
Yeah.
Like they did the funny things?
Yeah, yeah.
I would say Ray Nance in the later years with Duke. Then before Ray Nance was a guy named Freddie Jenkins. Excuse me. He was with Duke, and they would do the funny things, you know, in the band. And those would be my two greatest ones, I would think. Yeah, Ray and Freddie. Ray Nance keep you laughing all night.
Okay, and I would like to ask you if you have a final anecdote you'd like to leave us with.
Well, I just would like to say that you asked some very interesting questions, and they're very valid, and they were very good questions. And so far as jazz is concerned, I think here we don't appreciate it here in America, and it's not fair to the young people here. I know in Europe and in London and in France, kids in high school, 13, 14, 15 years old, are very well informed on jazz, of jazz musicians in the 30s, 40s, 50s. They know this like it's nothing. And here we are, where jazz originated from, here in America. And I don't think in our students here, it's not fair to them. To say they don't know is not fair, well, they're not informed. That's something that we've done. That's something that it's not fair to them, and I think we owe it to them. And they're not informed. And I think as Americans and as adults, we're missing something. And we're allowing a great history to slip away. It's a dying art. And I don't think it's fair that you have to go to Europe to find out about your own musicians and not just musicians, but it's so many of people in the 40s. They don't let their history die, whether it's art, whether it's in the drama department and it's music. They are very creative, and they respect it, and they nurture it, and they're young students in school is aware, they're constantly aware of what's going on, and they know their past, and we don't treasure ours, and I think it's something we're doing wrong, and we should correct it.
Yep.
That's right. That's the truth. Yep.
And so we're going to wrap up this interview at this time, and it's been wonderful having Buddy Tate with us, and Georgette, and
Artie.
yeah, who didn't get on camera, yes. And we're going to continue to do these interviews over a period of time, and hopefully make a difference in the cultural life of America.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, man.